The universe had forgotten this place, this ragged edge of existence the charter maps called the umbral expanse, but which the crews just called the drain, for it was where everything seemed to end. Light, hope, and the faint. Tinny signals from home that were supposed to remind them they were still part of something. Here, the void was not merely empty. It was a hungry, devouring quiet, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The stars themselves seemed muted, their ancient fire dimmed by the sheer, oppressive scale of the nothingness between them. On the bridge of the auditor-class vessel Stellacant, the silence was a profession. For 5 long years, they had drifted in this forgotten sea, a lone ghost ship on a mission of ghosts, listening for a voice that was almost certainly dead. They were hunting for the echo of the Arcadian colony, the last great expansion effort humanity had dared, which had pushed out into the expanse a generation ago with songs of discovery on its lips and then had simply vanished, not with a scream or a flash of light, but with a slow, deliberate fade, like a candle flame being gently cupped by an unseen hand. Alara sat cocooned in the deep listen chair, a lacework of neural filaments and biometric sensors draping over her as she became one with the ship's primary sensor array, the god's ear. Her job was not to hear sound, but to feel the shape of its absence, to parse the static between worlds for the patterns that bespoke a message, a gravestone, a warning. For 825 shifts, the static had been a flat, featureless drone, the background radiation of a dead cosmos. But today was different. It began not as a sound, but as an itch in the data stream, a flicker of impossibility deep in the quantum foam of the signal. It was a ghost, a whisper of a frequency that had no right to be there, an echo that had traveled backward in time to arrive. "Warden," she spoke, her voice a dry rasp that barely disturbed the tomb-like quiet of the bridge. "I have something." Warden Cassian moved from the forward viewport, his form a study in weary mass. His uniform of the remnant fleet faded to a soft gray that matched the perpetual twilight on the bridge. He had been old when this mission began, and the 5 years of listening to nothing had carved new, deeper lines into his face, turning it into a map of disappointment. "Define something." "Listener," he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together. Is it another star-grown a pulsar misfiring its rhythm? He had heard 1,000 false positives. The hope had long since curdled into professional skepticism. "No, sir," Alara said, her focus absolute, her own senses now stretched across light years of void. "This is structured. It's old, decayed, but it's artificial. It's being unmade." Cassian stopped, the skepticism in his eyes hardening into something sharper, more alert. "Unmade, not fading. No, the signal isn't weakening with distance. Its core data is actively collapsing. It's like I'm listening to a recording while someone is simultaneously pouring acid on the tape. The information is being corrupted from the inside out, faster than the light carrying it can travel. It's a paradox." He moved to stand behind her, his heavy presence a familiar weight in her consciousness. On the main hololith, she projected the waveform in an even to his less specialized eye. It was wrong. It wasn't the clean and sloping curve of natural decay. It was jagged, torn, with pieces of it missing as if they had been violently ripped from existence. The silence they had been studying was not an absence. It was an amputation. They were the last of their kind, or near enough to it. The remnant fleet was not a proud armada. It was the collection of survivors, the battered ships and weary souls who had limped away from the homeworld wars. A conflict not with aliens but with themselves, at a brutal civil war that had shattered humanity's empire and left them scattered and vulnerable. The Stellacant and its mission were an act of penance, a search for the lost children of a broken family, a last, desperate attempt to prove that they had not completely squandered their birthright to the stars. Now, the static was looking back. "Isolate it," Cassian commanded, his voice tight. "Filter the decay. I want to know what it's saying." For hours, Elara worked, her mind a scalpel slicing through layers of informational rot. She chased threads of syntax that dissolved into nonsense, found phonemes of a forgotten human dialect that fractured mid-syllable, and felt the chilling touch of the force that was unmaking them. It was an intelligent process, a kind of anti-creation. It wasn't destroying the message, it was convincing it that it had never existed in the first place. The crew watched in silence, the few dozen souls aboard the lonely vessel drawn to the bridge by the unspoken tension, the sudden, terrifying shift from monotony to mystery. They were explorers of a sort, but though they were also grave robbers. And it felt as though they had just struck something hollow that groaned back at them. Then, she had it. A fragment, just a few seconds, looped and stabilized enough to be coherent. She played it over the bridge speakers. A woman's voice, laced with a terror so profound it felt ancient, echoed in the stillness. "Not a weapon. It doesn't kill. It unsings us. It finds the frequency of a soul, of a world, and it plays the opposite note. A null hymn. You don't die. You are canceled. Arcadia isn't gone. Arcadia never was. Tell them. Tell them the choir is coming. They are the silence that thinks. Don't let them hear you. Find the chapel, the dead space, where the music, the message dissolved into a final, horrifying gurgle. The sound of a voice not being cut off, but being erased from the inside out. The very memory of language failing it. Silence returned to the bridge, but it was a new kind of silence, heavy and suffocating, filled with the ghost of that null hymn, the choir, the silence that thinks. Cassian stared at the hololith, his face ashen. "It unsings us," he repeated, the words tasting like poison. The fable of Arcadia had been one of tragedy, a brave colony lost to the harshness of the void. This message painted a picture of something infinitely worse, a civilization erased from the ledger of reality itself, its history, its art, its people not just killed, but rendered a lie. Warden, the tactical officer, a young man named Wren, with eyes that had not yet learned to be tired, spoke from his console. "Long-range resonance sensors are picking up. A pressure wave. No energy signature, no mass. It's a wave of absolute null entropy. It's moving this way." "The silence," Elara whispered, pulling the neural filaments from her scalp, the cold of the bridge air a shock against her skin. "They heard us listening. They're coming to erase the echo." They were a single, outdated auditorship, a vessel designed to listen, not to fight. They had a handful of kinetic defense cannons and a shield system that could barely repel a stray asteroid. Against a force that could unmake worlds, they were nothing. The protocols of the remnant fleet were clear upon contact with an unknown and superior hostile force. Retreat to the core systems and deliver the warning. It was the only logical, sensible thing to do. But Cassian looked at the terrified faces of his crew, at the lingering waveform of Arcadia's final, impossible plea. The warning was already incomplete, a fragment of a ghost story. By the time they limped back to Sanctuary, who would believe them? They would be dismissed as mad. Their data corrupted, their minds broken by the long isolation of the drain. The choir would continue its silent, unmaking march across the galaxy, and humanity would never even know to be afraid. He saw the logic spiraling out, the cold, hard calculus of their situation. Running was a death sentence, just a slower one. There was only one other path, one insane, desperate long shot buried in the dying words of a dead woman. "The chapel," Cassian said, his voice ringing with a sudden, terrible clarity. The dead space where the music. He turned to Elara. Was there anything else? A hint coordinates. Elara closed her eyes, delving back into the memory of the corrupted data, feeling for the ghosts of numbers that had been forcibly forgotten. There was a string of stellar coordinates, she said, her voice strained. But they were the most corrupted part of the signal. A ghost of a ghost. And, sir, they don't point away from the wave. They point directly into it. The destination is deeper in the expanse. Ren looked up from tactical. Sir, jumping into an unknown region based on a corrupted signal fragment while being pursued by a reality-nullifying force is not a recommended course of action. Nothing about our existence is recommended, Lieutenant, Cassian retorted, his gaze fixed on the star chart, on the gaping maw of the umbral expanse. He was looking at a choice between two impossibilities: flee with a useless warning and be hunted down, or chase a myth into the very heart of the thing that was hunting them. For 5 years, they had drifted, waiting for a sign. Now they had one, and it was a signpost pointing the way to oblivion. But it was also a signpost. Elara, plot the jump, he ordered, the finality in his tone cutting off all debate. Get me the cleanest possible version of those coordinates. Helm, prepare the Cascade Drive. Divert all non-essential power, including life support reserves and half the inertial dampeners. I want this jump to be instantaneous and violent. The crew stared, a mixture of terror and a strange, nascent excitement in their eyes. The monotony was over. The waiting was done. The warden was a man of cold logic and unwavering adherence to protocol. For him to cast the book aside, it meant they were either already dead or standing on the precipice of something that mattered more than their own survival. As Alara's fingers flew across her console, pulling the ghost of a location from the jaws of its own erasure, a low thrum began to vibrate through the deck plates of the Stellacant. It wasn't the sound of their own engines warming up. It was a deeper, more fundamental hum, the sound of the space around them beginning to thin, to forget itself. The null hymn was getting closer. Coordinates locked, Elara called out, her voice tight with strain. But Warden, the destination, it's not a star system. It's a point of absolute, perfect blackness. There's nothing there. No light, no gravity, no radiation. It's a hole in the universe. Cassian looked at the forward viewport, where the faint, distant stars were beginning to flicker, one by one, as if a great curtain was being drawn across the cosmos. A hole is exactly what we need, he said, his knuckles white where he gripped the command rail. A place where their song can't reach. Engage the drive. The Cascade Drive screamed to life, tearing a violent, momentary rift in space-time. The Stellacant did not glide into it. It was thrown. A rock skipped across an impossible ocean, plunging from the oppressive silence of the drain into a darkness that was somehow even deeper. They were no longer running from the enemy. They were racing it to a place that shouldn't exist. armed with nothing but a dead woman's last words and the desperate, uniquely human belief that even in a place where reality itself could be unwritten, there was always a loophole. The real war, Cassian knew, was not for territory or resources. It was a war for memory, for the right to have ever existed at all. And they were about to take their fight to a battlefield where the only rule was that nothing was real. The transition was not a journey, it was a punishment. The stellacant was ripped from one reality and violently birthed into another, and the process nearly broke it. Alarms screamed in a cacophony of metallic protest, and a dozen systems shrieking their death rattles at once. The lights flickered, died, and then returned as a sickly emergency red, bathing the bridge in the color of a fresh wound. Cassian was thrown against the command rail, the impact stealing the air from his lungs, his vision swimming in a sea of static. He could hear the groaning of stressed metal, the sharp crack of a viewport succumbing to pressure differentials that had no right to exist, and the quiet, horrified gasps of his crew. For a long moment, there was only damage control, a frantic dance of survival as engineers rerouted power from dead conduits and patched hull breaches with emergency force fields that shimmered like soap bubbles against the void. The Cascade drive was dead, its core fractured and leaking exotic particles that made the ship's sensors go blind. The primary communications array was a melted slag of circuits. They were alive, but they were deaf, dumb, and stranded. It was only after the initial chaos subsided, after the last fire was extinguished and the ship settled into a wounded, creaking silence, that they truly understood where they were. Alara, her face pale and beaded with sweat, was the first to put it into words. "The noise is gone," she whispered, her voice filled with a profound and terrifying awe. All of it. She was right. The constant, subtle hum of the universe was absent. The background radiation, the faint gravitational whispers of distant stars, the quantum fizz of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. It was all gone. Their sensors, the ones still functioning, displayed nothing but perfect, absolute zero across every spectrum. It was an empty space. It was an erasure of space. They were floating in a pocket of non-existence, a cosmic dead zone where the fundamental laws of physics had seemingly been put on hold. The lacuna. Cassian breathed, the name feeling right on his tongue. A gap, a missing piece. The dead space where the music couldn't play. Ren, ever the pragmatist, was checking the ship's internal chronometers against their last known timestamp. "Warden," he said, his voice unsteady. "According to our clocks, the jump took 4 minutes. According to the decay rate of our reserve power cells, we've been here for 3 weeks. Time, like everything else, was broken here." They had experienced a few minutes of violent transit, while their own ship's physics had endured an eternity. They were adrift in a place that not only defied reality, but actively unraveled it, and they had no way out. For days, or what they perceived as days, they drifted in that perfect, unnerving stillness. The psychological toll was immense. Crew members reported a sense of being watched by the absence, a feeling that the silence was not passive but predatory, without the subtle, constant input of a living universe. Their minds began to create their own phantoms. They saw movement in the corner of their eyes where no light existed to cast shadows. They heard whispers in the silence that their own life support systems should have drowned out. They were a single note of existence in an infinite symphony of nothing, and the sheer wrongness of it was beginning to fray their sanity. It was Alara who kept them anchored, while others felt the void as a threat. She experienced it as a canvas. With the god's ear shattered, She had to rely on her own innate, terrifying sensitivity. She would spend hours in the deep listen chair, not trying to hear, but trying to feel the texture of the silence itself. "It's not empty," she insisted to Cassian during one of their bleak, red-lit briefings. "It's balanced. The choir, the null hymn, that's an active, aggressive force. It's a shout of anti-sound. This place is different. This is true silence. It's primordial. It was here before the first star sang its first note, and it was in that primordial silence that she finally found it. There's a structure," she announced one shift, her voice calm but her eyes wide with a feverish intensity. "It's not reflecting light or energy. It's absorbing it. No, that's not right. It's negating it. It casts a shadow in the nothingness. It's a hole in the hole." Using Alara's feelings as their guide, they maneuvered the crippled Stellacant on low-power thrusters, a blind ship being led through a dark room by a woman who could see with her soul. And then they saw it. Or rather, they saw the effect of it. A region of the void ahead of them was even blacker than the impossible blackness surrounding it. It was a shape of absolute negation, a silhouette carved from the fabric of non-reality. As they drew closer, its scale became apparent. It was vast, easily the size of a small moon, and its geometry was a blasphemy. It was a cathedral of impossible angles, a structure built not of matter, but of the principles that governed its absence. It was the chapel. "Taking us in closer, Warden?" the helm officer asked, his voice trembling. He was staring at a structure that his brain insisted could not exist. "Take us right to the door," Cassian ordered, his heart pounding a defiant rhythm against the crushing silence. The closer they got, the more the structure revealed itself. Its surface was like polished obsidian, but it didn't reflect their emergency lights. It drank them, pulling the photons into itself without a trace. Etched upon this impossible surface were lines, patterns, and glyphs that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of perception. They were not writing, they were scars. The scars left behind by things that had been unsung. "It's a mausoleum," Alara whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "This is where the echoes of the canceled worlds are kept. This is a library of the choir's victims." As if in response to her words, a section of the structure's surface shimmered. It wasn't a door opening, but a piece of its negation momentarily, softening. An invitation. Cassian made the decision before he had even fully processed it. They couldn't stay on the ship, waiting for their power to die or their minds to break. The answer was in there. The weapon. The history. The reason it had to be. He assembled a small team himself. For command, Alara as their guide, and Ren for tactical analysis and to be the voice of caution Cassian knew he was ignoring. Clad in environmental suits that felt laughably inadequate, they crossed the few hundred meters from the Stellacant's airlock to the softened patch of the mausoleum on magnetic grapples, their tethers the only things connecting them to any semblance of their own reality. The moment they passed through the threshold, the world dissolved. It was not a place, Joe, but a state of being. They were floating in an endless white, gray twilight, surrounded by faint, shimmering motes of light, like dust motes in a sunbeam that had forgotten the sun. Each mote, Alara knew instinctively, was an echo, the preserved memory of a species, a world, a civilization, the last, dying note of a song that had been brutally silenced. She reached out a gloved hand toward the nearest one, a mote that pulsed with a soft, azure light. "Don't," Ren warned, his voice tinny in their comms. "We don't know what that is." But it was too late. Alara's fingers brushed the azure light, and her mind exploded. It was not a vision, it was a reliving. She was a member of a crystalline species whose thoughts were music and whose cities were symphonies carved from living glass. She felt their joy, their love, their art, the complex, beautiful harmony of their billion-year existence. And then she felt the choir. It came not as an invasion, but as a dissonance, a single, sour note introduced into their perfect chord. The note spread, a contagion of silence, turning their music into noise, their thoughts into static, their glass cities into tuneless, crumbling sand. She felt the terror of her people as they realized they were not being killed, but forgotten, their very essence being unraveled by the anti-music. She screamed in the memory of 1,000 million souls being canceled, the scream of a symphony being erased from the score. She collapsed in the gray void, her own mind reeling from the psychic backlash, the memory of a dead race now a scar upon her soul. Cassian rushed to her side, pulling her back from the azure moat. "Alara, report." Her voice came back, ragged and broken. They were beautiful. Their song, it was a perfect fifth. The choir, it is the tritone. The devil's interval. It doesn't destroy. It resolves. It resolves everything to silence. Before they could process her words, the gray space around them began to change. Their presence, their thoughts, their living, breathing song had disturbed the library's quiet. More motes began to glow, drawn to them. The ghosts of 1,000 murdered worlds stirring from their slumber, whispering their forgotten stories into the minds of the intruders. They were surrounded by the memories of the dead, a swirling galaxy of ghosts crying out for remembrance. But their intrusion had done something else. At the very edge of the lacuna, far beyond the mausoleum, the perfect silence was broken. A single and probing pulse of dissonance rippled against the boundary of the dead space. A note so sharp and wrong it was like a razor blade dragged across the fabric of reality. The choir had been searching for the echo of the Stella Cant. Now, thanks to them, it had heard a whole chorus of ghosts. It couldn't get in, not yet, but it knew they were here. It had found the library. The silence that thinks was now staring at the door. It was beginning to learn the shape of the key. The awakened echoes of the dead world swirled around them, a blizzard of shimmering motes, each a complete, agonizing history of a civilization erased. Alara, still trembling from the psychic trauma of the crystalline species nullification, fought to regain her composure. The lacuna, the chapel of Arcadia's dying words, was not a sanctuary but a grand cemetery, and their presence had stirred its restless dead. The pressure wave from the choir, a distant, malignant hum at the edge of the lacuna, intensified. It wasn't trying to breach the chapel's absolute silence through force, but through a chilling intelligence. It was mapping the boundary, testing the integrity of the non-space, feeling for weaknesses. "It's learning the frequency of this place," Alara whispered, her voice still raw from the borrowed screams. "It's trying to find the anti-note to this silence." Cassian scanned their immediate surroundings. The shimmering motes were beautiful, ethereal, but also dangerous. They were conduits to 1,000 forgotten horrors, each one a potential psychic trap. "We need to find the heart of this place," he said, his voice flat with grim determination, the source of its nullification. If it can hold back the choir, it might hold the key to fighting them. Guided by Alara, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural affinity for the twisted logic of the lacuna, they navigated the swirling nebula of spectral memories. Ren, despite his earlier reservations, proved invaluable. his sharp, tactical mind finding patterns in the chaos that even Alara's intuition struggled to define. He noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible current in the flow of the moats, a gentle, invisible river of memory leading them deeper into the core of the chapel. As they delved further, the gray twilight began to shift. The motes of memory grew denser, more vibrant, their light coalescing into vast, intricate tapestries of forgotten existence. They passed through what looked like an alien forest made of captured starlight, then a cityscape woven from the echoes of 1,000 voices. It was breathtakingly beautiful and overwhelmingly sad, a museum of all that humanity had lost, and all that it might yet lose. Eventually, they reached a central chamber. It was less a room and more a colossal, empty space carved from the very fabric of the lacuna. At its center, suspended in the absolute stillness, was an object unlike anything they had ever conceived. It was a perfect sphere of pure, unfiltered nothingness, a black hole not of gravity, but of anti-reality. It absorbed all light, all thought, all sensation, leaving only a perfect, palpable void. The null point, Alara breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound understanding. This is where all the lost songs come to die. This is the ultimate silence. As they stood before it, Ren's comms suddenly crackled with interference, a sound they hadn't heard since they entered the lacuna. It wasn't the choir. Not exactly, but a corrupted echo of it, bleeding through the chapel's defenses. Sir, the choir's trying to penetrate the lacuna. It's singing an anti-song to the chapel's silence. They're trying to collapse this dead space. The perfect sphere of nothingness at the chamber's center began to pulse, a faint, rhythmic contraction and expansion that sent shivers down their spines. It was reacting, fighting back. The chapel was alive, in its own terrifying way. Suddenly, from the edges of the chamber, 3 figures emerged. They were tall, gaunt, their forms cloaked in robes of deep, starless black that seemed to drink the meager light. Their faces were hidden beneath smooth, featureless masks, but their presence was ancient, heavy, and undeniably sentient. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their movements unhurried, as if time itself held no sway over them. Who are you?" Cassian demanded, raising his pulse rifle, a futile gesture against beings that radiated such profound antiquity. One of the figures raised a hand, and a voice deep and resonant resonated not in their ears, but in their very bones, bypassing their comms and environmental suits entirely. "We are the keepers of the unsung, the custodians of the lost frequencies, the last chord of civilizations that never were." "You're protecting this place?" Alara asked, her voice filled with desperate hope. "You're fighting the choir." "Fighting is a concept too violent for our purpose," another keeper replied, its voice equally profound. "We merely maintain the balance. This is the repository of forgotten melodies. Here, the choir's null hymn finds its counterpoint, and the erased are granted a final status existence." "But they're breaking through," Ren interjected, pointing to the intensifying ripples of dissonance at the edge of the chamber. "The choir is adapting. They're going to unsing this place too." The third keeper stepped forward, its gaze, though unseen behind the mask, felt intensely sorrowful. "Indeed, the cycle deepens. The choir learns. It is only a matter of time before the lacuna itself is folded into the grand silence. All things must eventually cease to be." "No!" Alara cried, stepping forward, the memories of the crystalline species still burning in her mind. You can't just let them. There must be a way to fight them, to reverse what they do. The keepers were silent for a long moment, their collective gaze fixed upon Ilara, as if seeing something profound within her. Then, the first keeper spoke again. The choir does not destroy. It resolves. It brings all discordant frequencies to their logical conclusion. Silence. To fight them, you must understand their music. And to understand their music, you must find its source. Where is it? Cassian pressed, lowering his rifle, sensing that violence here would be useless, perhaps even counterproductive. Their core, the keeper replied, its voice resonating with an almost alien patience. It resides within the grand crescendo, the heart of the umbral expanse, a place of pure, resonant antimatter. It is the locus where their null hymn is composed and projected. But if we go there, Ren began, we'll be erased before we even get close, and our ship is dead. We're trapped here. Not entirely, Ilara said, her eyes fixed on the pulsating null point. The Arcadian message. It said, find the chapel, the dead space where the music. What if it wasn't just a place to hide? What if it was a weapon? The keepers remained silent, their presence a weighty enigma. Ilara turned to Cassian. The cascade drive? It isn't just a jump engine. It rips reality. What if we could use the null point, this ultimate silence, to amplify that rip, not to jump away, but to punch a hole through the choir's own music? Cassian stared at her, then at the perfect black sphere. The insane logic of it began to form in his mind. You want to weaponize nothingness. We weaponize the lacuna's anti-note, Ilara clarified, her voice gaining a desperate certainty. We use its purity to sing an even deeper silence than the choirs. A silence that doesn't just resolve a song, but cancels the instrument playing it. The keepers finally stirred. The first one stepped closer to Ilara, its featureless mask tilting slightly. A bold thought. Human. To wield the silence not as a shield, but as a sword. It is a path of immense risk. The weaponization of the lacuna's power would destabilize this realm, leasing all the stored echoes into the wider universe, potentially destroying the very memories we protect. And you would risk being unsung yourselves by the very force you seek to unleash. We're already being unsung, Cassian declared, his eyes blazing with a defiant fire. Our entire species is. We don't have the luxury of simply fading away, or being cataloged in your quiet museum. We will fight for the right to be remembered, even if that memory is only of our failure. The keepers exchanged a silent, telepathic communication that felt ancient and profound. Then, the first one spoke again, its voice laced with a subtle change, a hint of something resembling respect. Then we will provide the means, but the price will be steep. Your ship, your Stellacant, must become the conduit. Its cascade drive, once repaired, will be fused with the null point. It will be a one-way journey into the grand crescendo. And for you, listener Ilara, you must guide the unleashed silence. You must become its conductor, its voice. Ilara looked from the terrifying black sphere to Cassian, then to Ren. She knew what they were asking, to fuse her mind, her very essence, with a weapon of cosmic negation, to become the vessel for a silence so absolute it could unravel existence. I accept, she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of all fear. She had heard the songs of 1,000 dead worlds. She would not let humanity become another. Ren, ever practical, still had a grim question. How do we repair the cascade drive, and how do we even get back to the ship from here? The third keeper raised its hand, and the gray twilight around them began to shimmer. A doorway, not unlike the one they had entered through, materialized at the edge of the chamber, leading back to the void where the stellacant floated. And beyond it, in the distant dark, a faint, rhythmic thrum resonated, the renewed, persistent pulse of the choir. Closer now, its anti-song growing louder. "We will guide you," the keeper said. "We will provide the energy required for the repair, drawn from the suffering of the unsung. But you must hurry. The grand crescendo is beginning to sing its loudest note, and when it does, all will be silent." They had found the chapel, and it had offered them not shelter, but a weapon so absolute, so terrifying, that its use might unleash chaos on a cosmic scale. But against a force that threatened to erase them from history, chaos might be their only hope. They were no longer auditors, they were executors, and their first target was the source of the silence that thinks. Their fight for memory had truly begun. Returning to the stellacant was a disorienting experience, a transition from the ethereal, logic-defying space of the chapel back into the cold, hard reality of a dying machine. The emergency lights still cast their bloody glow over the bridge, and the silence was no longer the profound, absolute stillness of the lacuna, but the tense, anxious quiet of a tomb waiting for its occupant. The keepers, true to their word, had not only shown them the way back, but had begun to facilitate the impossible. A shimmering, ethereal conduit of energy, a river of pure, harnessed memory drawn from the countless echoes within the mausoleum, now flowed from the invisible structure and into the crippled heart of the stellacant's engine room. The ship groaned and shuddered as this alien power surged through its systems, a ghost in its machine. Down in engineering, the ship's chief, a grizzled veteran named Anya Petrova, who had kept the rust bucket flying on little more than grit and recycled wire, stared at the Cascade Drive's exposed core. The fractal cracks in its containment vessel were now being sealed by the Keeper's energy, the shimmering light weaving through the damaged alloy like ethereal solder. "I've never seen anything like it," she muttered to Cassian, her voice a mix of awe and deep-seated unease. "This energy, it doesn't just repair. It remembers. It remembers the shape the drive was supposed to be and is convincing the metal to return to it. It's unnerving. Everything about this is unnerving." "Chief," Cassian replied, his gaze distant. "Just tell me if it will work." "Work." Petrova let out a short, harsh laugh. "Warden, when this is done, the drive won't just be repaired. It'll be reborn, fused with whatever that black hole of a thing is out there. It won't be a jump drive anymore. It'll be a cannon that fires holes in reality." Her face hardened. "But the power draw, when you fire this thing, it's gonna suck every last erg of energy from the ship. Life support, shields, even the emergency beacons. We'll have one shot. After that, we become a coffin." "One shot is all we need," Cassian said, his voice a low but steady anchor in the swirling sea of their insanity. Meanwhile, Elara was on the bridge, preparing for her own transformation. The deep listen chair, once her tool for passive observation, was being repurposed. Ren, his usual skepticism replaced by a focused, desperate ingenuity, helped her modify it, integrating strange, glyph-covered artifacts the Keepers had provided. These artifacts would act as a psychic interface, allowing her to connect not with the ship's sensors, but with the raw, untamed silence of the null point itself. She would become the focusing lens, that is the trigger, and the guidance system for a weapon of cosmic annihilation. As she settled into the chair, the cold filaments connecting to the ports on her scalp, she could already feel it, the profound, terrifying emptiness of the lacuna reaching out to her. A cold, silent god waiting for its herald. The motes of memory from the chapel still danced at the edges of her consciousness. The ghosts of 1,000 worlds whispering warnings and pleas. Don't fail. They seemed to say, don't let our silence be in vain. The pressure from the choir at the edge of the lacuna was now a constant, throbbing presence. It was no longer a subtle probe. It was a siege. The null hymn was being sung with a focused, relentless intensity, and the very fabric of the dead space was beginning to fray. On the main view screen, which could now only display sensor telemetry as abstract data, they could see the boundary of their sanctuary flickering, the perfect blackness occasionally erupting in bursts of violent static as the choir's song found a momentary weakness. They were running out of time. The drive is integrated. Petrova's voice crackled over the comms, strained and tired. The cannon is armed. Warden, we're ready to fire on your command, but once we begin the sequence, the ship is committed. There's no turning back. Cassian took his place at the command chair, the worn metal cool beneath his hands. He looked at the faces of his crew, at the fear, the exhaustion, and the stubborn, defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. They had started this mission as auditors, listeners in the dark. Now they were warriors, fighting not for land or resources, but for the fundamental right to exist. Ilara, he said, his voice soft but clear across the bridge. Are you ready? From within her cocoon of wires and alien artifacts, Ilara's eyes opened. They glowed with a faint, internal light, a reflection of the profound emptiness she was now touching with her mind. I am the silence, she whispered, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. And I have a note to play. Helm, Cassian commanded, his voice ringing with the finality of their choice. Take us out of the lacuna. Set a course for the coordinates the keepers provided. The grand crescendo. The ship, powered by its new, ghostly heart, moved with an unnatural grace. It slipped through the shimmering boundary of the lacuna, leaving the sanctuary of the chapel behind. The moment they re-entered the normal, albeit hostile, space of the umbral expanse, the choir's presence slammed into them with the force of a physical blow. It was no longer a distant hum. It was a deafening, mind-shattering roar of anti-sound that vibrated through the hull and into their very bones. The lights flickered violently, and the ship's few remaining systems screamed in protest. Shields are gone, Ren shouted, his hands flying across his console. Hull integrity dropping. The null hymn it's unmaking us at a molecular level. Stay on course, Cassian roared over the cacophony. Ilara, now. Ilara's body went rigid in the chair. Her eyes rolled back, and the faint light within them erupted into a brilliant, starless white. On the bridge, the air grew cold, and a silence so profound it was painful began to emanate from her, pushing back against the choir's overwhelming noise. She was no longer just Ilara. She was a conduit for the lacuna's perfect, primordial void. She was gathering the silence, shaping it, giving it intent. Through the forward viewport, they saw it, the grand crescendo. It was not a star or a nebula, but a vortex of pure, swirling anti-reality, a maelstrom of non-existence where the choir's song was born. It was a wound in the universe, and at its heart pulsed a malevolent, thinking darkness. That was their target. We're in range, the helm officer said, his voice strained, his knuckles white. But the ship is coming apart around us. Ilara, now, Cassian repeated, his voice a desperate prayer. Ilara screamed, but it was a silent scream, a psychic shockwave that flooded the bridge and the ship. The cascade drive, fused with the power of the null point, fired. It was not a beam of light or energy. It was a lance of pure, weaponized absence. A perfect cylindrical hole was punched through space-time, a corridor of absolute nothingness that shot from the stellacant and lanced directly into the heart of the grand crescendo. For a moment, there was a terrible cosmic stalemate. The choir's all-consuming null hymn met the lacuna's perfect, unmaking silence. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The roar of the anti-music faltered, replaced by a sound of confusion, of a symphony suddenly forgetting its notes. And then, the grand crescendo began to collapse. The weaponized silence did not destroy it. It resolved it. It gave the choir the one thing it sought to impose on all others: absolute, final, and utter cessation. The vortex of anti-reality folded in on itself, the malevolent darkness at its core imploding not with a bang, but with a final, silent whimper. The null hymn that had plagued the galaxy died, its last note unsung. On the bridge of the stellacant, the crew watched in stunned silence as the source of their terror was simply erased. The oppressive, mind-shattering noise was gone, replaced by the familiar, gentle hum of a living, breathing universe. The distant, muted stars of the umbral expanse seemed to shine a little brighter. They had done it. They had won. But their victory came at a terrible price. As the last echo of the lacuna's power faded, the lights on the bridge died for good. The hum of the ship's systems faded into a final metallic sigh. They were adrift by a dead ship in the middle of nowhere, with no power, no communication, and no hope of rescue. Cassian turned his gaze to the deep-listened chair. Ilara was slumped over, the light in her eyes extinguished. She was still breathing, but her connection to the silence, her role as its conductor, had shattered her. She was a ghost in her own body, her mind lost in the infinite, silent ocean she had unleashed. They had won the war for memory, but their own herald had become a casualty of the very silence she had wielded. They were alive, but they were alone, and the cost of their victory was only just beginning to be counted. The victory was silent, and in the silent, powerless tomb of the stellacant, the cold began its slow, merciless conquest. Without power, the ship's internal temperature plummeted, and a delicate layer of frost began to creep across the inside of the viewports, obscuring the newly peaceful stars. The crew, huddled together on the bridge in their environmental suits, shared the last of the emergency oxygen packs, their breaths fogging the inside of their helmets. They had saved the galaxy, but their reward was a slow, anonymous death in the dark. Cassian stood by the command chair, his hand resting on its arm, a captain on a ship that had already sunk beneath the waves of the void. His gaze was fixed on Ilara. She was still in the deep-listened chair, a pale, still effigy of the woman she had been. Ren had done what he could, disconnecting her from the alien artifacts. But her mind was gone, lost in the echo of the great silence she had unleashed. She was a hero, a savior, and a ghost. Days turned into a week, or perhaps it was an hour. Time had lost its meaning again, measured now only by the dwindling pressure gauges on their oxygen tanks and the encroaching, bone-deep cold. Despair was a quiet, insidious thing, far more patient than the choir had been. It didn't need a null hymn. It needed only time and silence. It was during a period of shared, grim quiet that Ren, ever the analyst, noticed the anomaly. His console was dead, but he was staring at the frost on the main viewport. "Warden," he said, his voice a strained whisper through the comms. "Look, the frost, it's forming patterns." Cassian moved to the viewport. Ren was right. The ice crystals were not random. They were arranging themselves into intricate, geometric shapes, patterns of impossible complexity that echoed the glyphs they had seen on the surface of the mausoleum. As they watched, the patterns began to glow with a soft, internal luminescence. The cold in the bridge did not retreat, but it seemed to lose its malicious edge. The light was faint, but it was not the red of an emergency. It was the gentle, pearlescent white of a new dawn. "What is it?" Petrova's voice crackled, her pragmatic mind struggling to comprehend the sight. Before anyone could answer, a new voice spoke, not over the dead comms, but directly in their minds, just as the keepers had. But this was not one voice. It was a chorus, a symphony of 1,000,000,000 different thoughts speaking in a single, harmonious chord. "You have broken the vessel," the chorus sang, "and we are free." A collective gasp went through the bridge crew. It was the echoes, the souls, the memories from the chapel. The keepers had warned that weaponizing the lacuna would destabilize it, releasing them. Their final desperate act had not just destroyed the choir, it had shattered the prison of the unsung. The motes of light they had seen in the mausoleum now appeared outside the ship, a swirling, nascent galaxy of azure, crimson, and gold. They were no longer faint specks of dust, they were vibrant, conscious points of light, each one the soul song of a lost civilization. And they were coming for the Stellacant. They did not attack. They embraced. The swarm of lights enveloped the dead ship, and a miracle began to unfold. The frost on the viewports melted, not from heat, but from a gentle, resonant energy. The dead consoles flickered to life, their screens displaying not Terran data, but the flowing, elegant script of a species that had written its laws in light. The ship's internal gravity reasserted itself, and the oppressive cold was replaced by a comfortable, neutral warmth. Anya Petrova watched in stunned disbelief from a bridge monitor as, down in engineering, the fractured Cascade drive was not just repaired, but reformed. Crystalline structures grew over the damaged alloys, and conduits of pure light replaced the melted wiring. The Stellacant was not being fixed. It was being reborn, remade by the grateful ghost it had liberated. Cassian found himself gripping the rail as the ship hummed with a new, vibrant life, a power that felt both ancient and utterly new. He turned his attention back to Alara. A single, brilliant azure mote, the very first one she had touched in the chapel, floated down from the ceiling and hovered before her face. It pulsed with a gentle rhythm, and then it drifted forward, merging with her. Alara's eyes snapped open, but they were not her eyes anymore. They were star fields, swirling nebulas of deep blue and silver. She rose from the chair, no longer a broken casualty, but a being transformed. She was still Alara, but she was also more. She was the vessel, the living library for all the worlds the choir had erased. The silence she had wielded had hollowed her out, and now the liberated songs were filling the void. "We are remembered." The chorus spoke through her, her own voice a quiet anchor in a sea of countless others. "You did not just save yourselves. You gave us back our past. Our music can be sung again." Cassian looked at the woman who was and was not his listener. He saw the immense burden she now carried, but he also saw a strength, a purpose, that transcended anything he had ever known. "What happens now?" he asked, speaking to the legion she represented. "Your ship is no longer just a human vessel," they replied. "It is a sanctuary, a traveling chapel. We have given it new life, drawn from our own forgotten technologies. It is faster, stronger, more than it ever was." The name Stellacant felt inadequate now, a relic of a lesser age. In the crew's minds, a new name settled, a gift from the chorus, the Stellacant Requiem. "Your mission is not over," the voice continued, a hint of Ilara's own determination shining through. "We are free, but we are homeless. We are echoes without a world. Will you help us find a new one? Will you be our auditors once more? Not to listen for the dead, but to guide the reborn." Cassian looked out the main viewport. The umbral expanse was no longer a dead corner of the galaxy. It was alive with the light of 1,000 liberated souls. They had plunged into the darkness hunting a single lost colony and had returned with an entire galaxy of ancestors. Their war for memory had ended. Their new journey, a pilgrimage of remembrance, was about to begin. He looked at his crew, at their tired but awestruck faces, and he saw not the weary survivors of a forgotten fleet, but the first pioneers of a new and unimaginably richer humanity. "Helm," he said, his voice clear and steady, filled with a purpose he had not felt in a lifetime. "Set a course. Outward. The Stellacant Requiem, a vessel of human grit and alien ghosts, turned its newly luminous hull toward the unknown, leaving the silence of the drain behind forever. On its bridge, a woman with stars in her eyes stood beside her captain, no longer just listening to the silence, but conducting the grand, defiant, and beautiful symphony of all that had refused to be forgotten.